This Yom HaZikaron is different than all the Yomei Zikaron that we commemorated in the past. For the first time, families and their relatives, loved ones, friends that normally fill this cemetery here, we're standing at Herzl, will not be able to attend. When we come, we bring the yeshiva here every year, Yom HaZikaron morning, around the time of the siren, 11 o'clock, and there are thousands and thousands of people. You can't, this area in particular, you can't walk here. There are a lot of unbelievable stories, individuals, heroes here, buried here, and there are hundreds in this just one section, maybe 1,000, several thousand, and throughout Har Herzl, thousands of people come. And it's one of the most moving experiences that I've had in my life, and for our students and to our traga, or anyone who's been here, knows how important this commemoration is. And it's so unfortunate that so many families won't be able to come on that particular day. We arrived here several days before, and there are many families that are here, knowing that they won't be able to come on Yom HaZikaron, and they're here wearing their masks and gloves, to come to be with their father, their brother, their son. Don't want to let this day pass without visiting them and expressing to them and to HaKadosh Baruch Hu how much they mean to them. We are going to be celebrating on Yom HaAtzmaut tomorrow 72 years, and we only can celebrate because of the sacrifices that were made here in Har Herzl. About 3,000 are buried here, and in the 52 military cemeteries. All told, as of last year, 2019, the number was 23,741, which the number begins, the counting begins in 1860, when the first movement outside the walls of Jerusalem, and Jews started living outside of the old city walls. That's really beginning the Zionist movement. That's when we started the count of 23, that today numbers 22,700 plus. I don't know the exact number as of today, but Yom HaZikaron 2019, 23,741. As I mentioned, it's been our tradition, our yeshiva, to come to Har Herzl every year. We actually would come twice. We come at night, the night of Yom HaZikaron, when it's not as crowded, and we come for a tour and we visit many of the different kvarim, individuals, and share their stories. The truth is, we should spend 3,000 visits visiting all the different people that are buried here. We don't have the time. We're only going to be able to visit several people that are buried here. And what I think we should do, or try to do, is each one of us should pick one person in particular that maybe touched you, their story touched you, and over the course of the day to learn in their memory. Of course, in the memory of all of them, but maybe one in particular that you're going to take on this person. It may be Emmanuel Moreno, it may be Ro'i Klein, it may be Sariel Birnbaum, it may be Esther Tselingold. There are some of the other individuals that we're going to stop and visit. But one of the things we have to also understand, Har Herzl is not too far from Yeshiva Torah Traga. We walk it in every Yom HaZikaron. It takes us about 20 minutes to walk. And one of the great rabbis in the last generation, someone who I had the privilege of meeting, the Gedolei Hador, is Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. He died in 1995, I believe. I think this year was the 25th anniversary in Adar. And he was the Rosh Yeshiva in Kol Torah, here also in Bayit Vegan, Rehova Piska. And one morning, boys in the yeshiva, Bachram in the yeshiva, came to him and said, Rebbe, we're going to go up north. One of our friends' mother is very sick. We're going to go up north to pray by the Kivrei Tzadikim. And he said, why do you have to travel up so far up north? You can just go down the block. Down the block, Rehova Piska, is Har Herzl. He says, when I want to daven by Kedoshim, by holy people, Tzadikim, That's where I go. We stand here in Har Herzl amongst the Kedoshim. These are the holy, holy individuals who gave their life for the Jewish people. Every single one is a Kadosh, is holy, and this is an unbelievable thing to be able to stand here, to be able to daven here. Unfortunately, for most of us this year, we won't be able to do that. But wherever we are, in the memory and the zchut and the merit of these tzaddikim, we can daven to Hashem to bring Yeshuot for the Jewish people.
וכשקרא שמע ישראל, הרוח חרש את שמו נשא רועי השם.
Ro'i Klein, one of the greatest heroes of the Jewish people in our time. Ro'i Klein was killed in the Battle of Beit Jabal in Lebanon, the Second Lebanon War in 2006, the summer 2006. And he was a student in Eli, in the Mechina of Eli. He was 31 years old at the time. In Miluim, he was a commander of one of the elite units. And the story is well known, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, that he, in battle, in one of the most difficult battles where many soldiers were lost, a grenade was thrown. He jumped on that grenade, a live grenade. He jumped on it in order to save his fellow soldiers, his soldiers. He was the commanding officer at that battle, and screaming Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, he gave his life. He was awarded the equivalent of the Purple Heart in Israel, and he left his almana, his widow, with several children behind. We have in our yeshiva, we have his notes that he wrote, person who was Torah notes, published later on posthumously. He was someone who was kovei itim l'Torah, worked on himself. He used to get up early in the morning before going to work, and he had a 2-hour chavrusa in the Beis Medrash of Eli before heading off to work. Such a disciplined individual, one of the best that Israel produces. And he's become a symbol of self-sacrifice, of Mesirut Nefesh for his friends, for the Jewish people. He wasn't the first. There are several people buried here actually in Har Herzl who acted in a similar fashion in previous wars where they jumped on a grenade or took a bullet in place of their friend. And he is a symbol of the heroism, of the strength of the Jewish people. Yehi Zichro Baruch. We're standing at the kever of Jason Friedberg, Yehoshua Friedberg. Yehoshua Friedberg grew up in Montreal, made Aliyah, learned in yeshiva at Machon Meir, and he was killed at the age of 24 in 1993. At the time, I was in the Gris Kollel. I think it was my second year in the Gris Kollel at the time, and we were in the middle of Shir. Rabbi Miller was giving shir to the kollel, and all of a sudden one of the guys in the kollel, one of our friends, comes running in. His name is Baruch Tenenbaum, lives now in Ramat Beit Shemesh. He comes running in, he says, screaming, I need help, I need help. My cousin has gone missing, can you please help find him? And he calmed down. We've got the story that his cousin Yehoshua Friedberg, who was in the army at the time, had gotten into was hitching a ride from Jerusalem to his base, and at that time, there were several kidnappings of soldiers. One of them is Nachshon Waxman, which we've also spoken about. He got into a car, thought was religious people. Turns out they were dressed up as religious people, and they were terrorists. And according to the intelligence, he was dropped somewhere near the area of Beit Meir. Those of you who've been to Etziasoy Kollel, just right at the exit of from the Jerusalem highway going up to Beit Meir, where the Kollel is and where Or Yerushalayim is. So we got on buses, the entire Kollel, and also the students in BMT at the time, and we went on a search, and we're looking. Spent several hours looking, and one of the groups, we were one of many buses, but one of the groups found his body had been dumped along the side of the road off the highway, and tragically he was killed while serving in Tzahal, and tragically lost his life. He was engaged at the time, and it was a big loss for us. Somebody who had been inspired to come to Israel as a lone soldier. One of the students, one of our alumni, Ari Zeitz, his father grew up, was a childhood friend of his in Montreal. And so this was something that was very tragic. And the first time actually I came to Har Herzl on Yom HaZikaron was that year, Yom HaZikaron, and they made a shloshim for him. He was killed in Adar, but they had Hakamat Matzeva. It was the first time when we gathered here, this very spot, that year in 1993. All the guys from the Kollel, a lot of guys from BMT, we stood here, and every year since then we come to pay respects to him, and Tehei Nishmato Tzura B'Tzura Chaim. Sariel Mordechai Birnbaum, son of Devorah and Elisha Birnbaum, is somebody who very close to me personally, to my family, and to us as Yeshiva Torah Traga. Every year when we come to Har Zikaron, this is the kever that we come to when the siren sounds, and usually for years we stood next to Elisha and to Devorah, and then since they've left this world, to their children, Sariel's brothers. And I'll explain what I mean. My grandmother grew up in Karlsbad in Czechoslovakia, and one of her childhood friends was Elisha Birnbaum. Elisha Birnbaum was my uncle's, my grandmother's brother's best friend, and they actually came together to Eretz Yisrael. They escaped from Europe. They came on Aliyat HaNoar and came to Israel. And he entered into Yeshiva Kfar Ro'eh, which at the time was a new yeshiva. And Elisha's family remained behind in Czechoslovakia, his parents and his 7 siblings. My grandmother also managed to escape from Europe and got to America. She managed to get her parents out through visas already after the war had started. And then in 1941 she tried to get Elisha's parents out. This is Sariel's grandparents. And we have a letter that we found after my grandmother passed away. We have a letter that she received in response from the American consulate in Vienna. It says it was dated 1941, American consulate, Vienna, Germany, because this is already after the Anschluss, after Germany had annexed Austria, and it was a rejection letter that although she had put $4,000 in 1941 in escrow to secure that money would be used for this family, but they said it's not enough money for 9 people. $4,000 in 1941, you can look it up, Google it. It's equivalent of 2 years' salary in 1941, and yet they said it wasn't enough money for 9 people, and they were rejected. And so the fate of that family, parents and 7 children, they were sent to Birkenau, and in Yud Bet Tammuz 1942 they were killed in the gas chambers. Elisha was the only one that survived in his family. Elisha and his wife Devorah had several children. The oldest son was Sariel Birnbaum. They served in Shlichut in Toronto and then raised their son here. He studied in Yeshivat Netiv Meir here in Beit Vegan, and then was the first machzor, the first group of students to join a new yeshiva called Yeshivat Har Etzion, otherwise known as Gush. After spending time in Hesder and serving in the tanks, he then came to Yerushalayim and was the madrich in BMT. BMT, the precursor of Yeshiva Torah Traga, the same building they were in, was where BMT was. And he was madrich and studying in Hebrew University at the time, and then in 1973, Yom Kippur War breaks out. he actually went to Yeshiva Herzl to daven for Yom Kippur. And you can imagine what that Yom Kippur was like. The war breaks out in the middle. The army sends jeeps to every single shul, yeshiva in the country, telling the men that they're going to have to mobilize. Some of them were pulled right away. Some of them said right after the Yom Tov is out, you have to report. Can you imagine what Ne'ilah was like? People who were there describe all you could hear was screams and cries coming from the women's section and probably from the men's section as well. And so immediately after the davening is out, he goes and reports. He doesn't even have enough time to put on his uniform. He goes in his Yom Tov clothing. And the very next day, as you can see here, the very next day, Yud Aleph Tishrei, he falls in the Golan as part of the tanks. He was together with Dov Indig, who wrote the book Letters to Talia, highly recommended book, and also Chaim Sabato was in the same group of tanks with him, the famous author and Rosh Hashiva of Malay Adumim. This book, Kisarita, is a book that's put out in memory of Sariel Birnbaum. And the truth is that almost every religious soldier has a sefer like this, Divrei Torah, that they may have written, the collection of hespedim, of eulogies that were given at the time, and also other Divrei Torah from friends, from Rebbeim that he collected. His brother Shmuel Birnbaum shares Divrei Torah every week that I get and spreads around the world. He was a Ram in Kfar Oer, where his father had studied. And one of the things that I just want to share, one particular story, took place years after Sariel passed away. And this, I think, is one of the most important messages that you'll hear today. Alicia shared this story with the Rosh Hashiva BMT at the time, Rabbi Horowitz. They used to call him Rabbi Whitey Horowitz. Rabbi Horowitz was, as he shared the story when I was in Grus Kollel, Elisha was traveling. He was driving from Yerushalayim to Tel Aviv, and his practice was to pick up soldiers if he saw soldiers trying to hitch a ride. And he sees this soldier in a tan uniform, pulls over, and says, "Come, where are you headed?" He says, "I'm going to the Kiryah in Tel Aviv." He says, "Okay, I'm going right there." And he sees this man is exceptionally tall. He's wearing a tan uniform, which is a uniform of the Israeli Air Force, and he has a kippah on his head. Now, at those times, to have a religious soldier in the Air Force was very rare. And he starts to talk to him, and he has an American accent. A religious American in the Air Force, unheard of at that time. And he starts to talk to him. He says, how'd you get to the Air Force? He said to him, I was in yeshiva, and I decided to join the army. I had a very high profile, and I had the gibush. I had these tests, and I scored high, and I was able to get into the Air Force. He said, "Yeah, but what motivated you to decide to join the Israeli army?" He said, "I'll tell you, I was in BMT for the year. I'd gone to Yeshiva High School, the regular camps, modern Orthodox camps, and I went to BMT. And I was planning on going back to Queens College just to continue my life, as most of my friends were doing. And Yom HaZikaron, the yeshiva took us to Har Herzl. And we were split up, and we stood, different guys stood by different families, and we got to hear about their son. The family shared with us. And I was thinking to myself, this guy was basically around my age, and he gave his life for the Jewish people. What am I going to do for the Jewish people? And it's about that time that I decided that maybe I should also do something for the Jewish people, and I decided to join the army. And Alicia turned to me and says, "Do you remember the name of the family that you visited or that spoke to you?" He says, I don't remember the name of the family, but I remember the name of the soldier, because it was an unusual name. His name was Sariel. And Alicia, with tears in his eyes, says, "That's my son. You must have heard from my wife." And so the question that we all have to ask ourselves is, what are we going to do for the Jewish people? Every single one of the people lying here, men and women, gave their lives to Jewish people. What are we going to do? Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to join the Israeli army, although maybe that is an answer for some of us. But we have to live our life. The default decision in our life has to be, whatever we choose is like, how is this going to help the Jewish people? And that could be a micro decision or a macro decision, but that should be at the forefront of all of our decisions. What are we going to be doing for the Jewish people? As many of you know, Sariel Birnbaum is an unusual name, as I mentioned earlier. And one time when we came here, right before we came on Yom HaZikaron, so one of the guys in Grus Kola who was very involved in the yeshiva came over to me and said, I hear you're going to Herzl today. I said, yes. He goes, and I hear you're going to the kever of Sariel Birnbaum. I said, yes. He said, well, do you mind if I join you? I said, no, sure, but how do you know Sariel Birnbaum? And then I thinking, one second, your name is Sariel Malitsky. That's a crazy name, Sariel. He goes, yeah, I'm named after Sariel Birnbaum. Rabbi Sariel Malitsky, his parents, he was born, I think it was 1976, and you can correct me. He was named after Sariel Birnbaum. Why? What's his connection? His uncle, I think his name is Larry Malitsky, was a student in BMT, and his madrich was Sariel Birnbaum. And Sariel had such an impact on Larry Malitsky, and at the time, when Sariel was born, his grandparents were alive. They didn't have to name after one of his grandparents, and they had such an impact on them and on his life, on his uncle's life, on his parents' life, that they decided to name him Sariel. And there are many people actually in this book, all the different children of the Birnbaum family, of other families, who were impacted by the tragic loss of Sariel, and were named after him. And so we came here, and it was actually a beautiful reunion between Sariel Malitsky and Alicia Birnbaum. It was very emotional. I think I was the one crying more than anyone else, but it was a very beautiful moment of Sariel meeting Sariel's parents, Alicia and Devorah. Esther Zahlengold made Aliyah from England. She was a fiery religious Zionist, part of what was the nascent B'nai Akiva movement, and came on Aliyah before the establishment of the State of Israel. And she was an English teacher, and because of the situation and not having enough soldiers, she was forced to take up arms to train, and living in the old city, to learn how to shoot and to defend the old city. Many had been taken captives by the Jordanians, and she, together with her friends, fought a valiant battle. Tragically, she was killed Chaf B'Iyar. Several 2 weeks after the Israeli declared independence, in the middle of the Independence Day War, and but she left a tremendous legacy. So many in England and other parts of the world have named snifim, chapters of B'nai Akiva, after her. A symbol of great strength, of great pride, and a lot of it's because she left a letter. She left a very, very moving letter that I would like to read to you. A letter that was found on her person and was sent to her family after she had passed away. And here's the letter that she left for her family, May 23rd, 1948. Dear Mommy, Daddy, and everyone. If you get this at all, it will be, I suppose, typical of all my hurried, messy letters. I'm writing it to beg of you that whatever might have happened to me, you will make the effort to take it in the spirit that I want, and to understand that for myself, I have no regrets. We have had a bitter fight. I have tasted of Gehenna, but it has been worthwhile, because I'm convinced that the end will see a Jewish state, and the realization of our longings. I shall only be one of many who fell in sacrifice. And I was urged to write this letter because one in particular was killed today who meant a great deal to me. Because of the sorrow I felt, I want you to take it otherwise. To remember that we were soldiers and had the greatest and noblest cause to fight for. God is with us. I know in his holy land, and I am proud and ready to pay the price it may cost to reprieve it. Don't think that I have taken unnecessary risks. That does not pay when manpower is short. But I did find the excitement I always needed, and I have enjoyed it. I hope that you may have the chance of meeting any of my co-fighters who survive, if I do not, and that you will be pleased and not sad of how they talk of me. Please, please do not be sadder than you can. I have lived my life fully, if briefly, and I think that is the best way, short and sweet. Very sweet it has been here in our own land. I hope you will enjoy from Mimi and Asher the satisfaction you have missed in me. But let it be without regrets, and then I too shall be happy. I am thinking of you all, every single one, and I am full of pleasure at the thought that you will one day, very soon I hope, come and enjoy the fruits of that for which we are fighting. Much, much love, and remember me only in happiness. Shalom and lehitraot. Your loving Esther. Okay, we're standing here alongside this mass grave. You know, when we think about mass graves, we usually think about Poland, we think about the Holocaust. But here in Israel, this is perhaps the most well-known of the mass graves that we have. These are the Kedoshim, the holy fighters of Kfar Etzion. I imagine many of you have been to the museum in Kfar Etzion and have heard the story. Kfar Etzion had the unfortunate situation of being on the other side of the armistice line in 1948. This was the area that was supposed to be part of Jordan, and as a result they were surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of Jordanians and militiamen, and were killed. Men and women, children. They had evacuated many of them, but many of them stayed behind to fight. And one of the other well-known stories related to this terrible tragedy and massacre was the story of the Lamed Hay, the 35 soldiers that had been sent to try to assist in the battle. Right alongside here you have the burial area of the 35. And it's also a well-known story. If you've read Tzaddik in Our Time of Arya Levine, the 35 were massacred. They couldn't access the bodies for months and months and months. Only in October, November, several months later, were they able to get to those bodies. In fact, there are about 600 soldiers that were buried here. Soldiers and civilians, 300 soldiers, and then later on another 600 that were killed during the Independence Day War in 1948, and only were brought to burial here in Yerushalayim in 1949, almost a year later. And months went by, and you can imagine the state of the bodies at the time. They were maybe temporarily buried elsewhere, and then brought here to burial. And this was opened at that time. Har Herzl I'm talking about. So the Lamed Hay were 35 young men, and they couldn't identify the bodies because they were so mutilated by the Arabs that had killed them. Of course, you know the story that they were traveling this area. We're actually not so far from Beit Shemesh, trying to go through the mountains, through the fields. They came across an Arab. There was a whole debate whether to let him go. He promised he wouldn't tell anybody, and of course he went and told his chaverim, and then they were surprise attacked. It was an ambush, and they were killed and again mutilated. They couldn't identify the bodies. They went to Rav Aryeh Levine, and he did a Goral Hagra, famous practice of the Vilna Gaon, of a certain kind of using a certain kind of Tanakh, turning pages back and forth, and then whatever pasuk it would land on, whatever page it would point to a pasuk, and they were able to identify. Rav Aryeh was able to identify 34 of the dead. The name would appear. There was one named Binyamin. The Binyamin Amar. He did Hashem. Shkon Levetach. Turns out that page, Reuven fell out on Reuven. And so, as they stood over each body, they were able to identify it in a miraculous way, and that's how they're buried. They're not buried in Kever Achim. Here, however, the situation was much worse. There's basically, I think, over 100 people buried in this area. And one of them is Esther Kaufman. And I point specifically to Esther Kaufman because Esther Kaufman was born in Poland. And she made Aliyah in 1947. And she fell in this krav in Gush Etzion. She was 24 years old. Esther Kaufman was what's called the Netzer Acharon. She was the last, the remnant of her entire family that was killed in the Holocaust in Poland. And there's a monument which we're going to show you. The monument which commemorates the Netzer Acharon monument. There are hundreds of Israelis who were killed in 1947 and then also in the subsequent wars, who were the last remnant of their entire family that had been wiped out in the Holocaust and then came here to Israel only to fall in battle here. And so there's nobody left of these families. Esther Kaufman is one of those tragic cases. To share a story that Rabbi Riskin shares. It's in his book, Stories My Grandfather Told Me. Rabbi Riskin was the rabbi at the time in Lincoln Square. And he became the rabbi in the late 60s. And he said one of the first functions he had as rabbi was a Tzeitzchem L'Shalom, a party, bidding farewell to the Schwartzes. Rabbi and Mrs. Schwartz were making Aliyah. He was an elderly man, Holocaust survivor. He had been married previously in Poland. His wife and children had been killed. His wife, the same, had been married previously. Her husband and children killed. They met, two broken souls joined together, and they had two children together. And they were making Aliyah with their two children. And that was one of the first things he had function as rabbi. And then fast forward to 1973, in the middle of the Yom Kippur War, he decides to lead a mission of some of the wealthier members of his community to come to Israel and to show support, financial, emotional support to Israel that was in the middle of war. And he comes, he gets off the plane, he checks into the hotel, he opens up the Jerusalem Post, and there he sees in the obituary section, Rabbi and Mrs. Schwartz are sitting shiva for their son. This is their second son, who was killed in 1973 in that war that he came, and their oldest son had tragically been killed in 1967, the 1967 war. And so, even though he just arrived and he was leading this mission, he felt it was his duty to go and pay a shiva calling. He goes to Rehov Shimoni, I think it's number 8, the building there, and he arrives in this small apartment, cramped apartment, and it was packed with people. And there he looked in the front, was Rabbi and Mrs. Schwartz, these Holocaust survivors who had lost their family in the Holocaust and now lost their two sons fighting for Israel. And there was nothing anyone could say, total silence. And after 45 minutes, he had to get back to his group. He makes his way to the front, and he stands over the Schwartzes and says, "Hamakom Yinachem Eschem B'Sosha V'Leitzion Mishalayim," not knowing if Rabbi Schwartz recognized him. And then he looked up Rabbi Schwartz and says, "Is that Rabbi Riskin?" He says, "Yes." He said, "Rabbi Riskin, let me ask you, why of all the names of God do we say Hamakom Yinachem Eschem? Why do we choose this language of the place, that name of God?" Because I was always wondering this, but now I think I finally understood. He says, when my family was killed in the Holocaust, my wife's family was killed in the Holocaust, there was almost no consolation. There was nothing left of us. But now that we were Zoche two holy sons for the Holy Land. We say Hamakom Yenachem Eslem, the place, Eretz Yisrael, can serve as a consolation. My sons did not die in vain. They were zocha to give their lives for the Holy Land. This place, Eretz Yisrael, is our consolation. The Jewish people living here and thriving here. And today, looking back 40 plus years from that time, 47 years ago, almost, we can be consoled by the beauty of Eretz Yisrael, the people of Israel. There's nearly 7 million Jews living here. We're almost half of the Jewish people living here and waiting for everyone else to arrive. Eretz Yisrael is our consolation to all the dead that have fallen in its battles. Staying here at the kever, beside the kever of Yoni Netanyahu. I'm sure he's familiar to almost all of you. Obviously the older brother of our Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Yoni Netanyahu fell valiantly in Entebbe, in the famous Operation Entebbe. He was 30 years old. He was a member of the Sayeret Matkal, the most elite commando unit in Israel, and a miraculous operation where they managed to bring back to Israel over 100 Israelis who had been hijacked. Growing up, I remember I was a young boy at the time. It was in the middle of the Olympics, and we had family friends of ours, the Aronovich, Miriam and Eitan Aronovich, who were on that flight, who had been kidnapped and hijacked. One of my friends, old childhood friends, Mordechai Shaw, was a cousin of Aronovich's, and I remember davening for them in my dining room that should be safe. And miraculously, over Shabbat, they sent in this commando unit, and Netanyahu, unfortunately, tragically, leading the battle was the one soldier that was killed in battle. It particularly also our son, one of our sons, my son Yisrael, was when he was in the army, he began in Sayeret Matkal. He began in this commando unit, and as the case is, and I'm not sure what they're doing this year in Yom HaZikaron, but basically they have, at every kever, they have a soldier standing, or they try as much as they can. And so if you were in tanks in Shiryon, they would send you to someone who fell in tanks in Shiryon. And if you were fighting in Egoz, so you stand by someone who was from Egoz who had fell. So a number of years ago, when he was in Sayeret Matkal, afterwards he left to a different unit, but his assignment was to stand here beside the kever of Yoni Netanyahu. And so he was here Yom HaZikaron. I was a very proud father to stand next to him as he stood beside the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Unfortunately, we weren't allowed to take pictures of that, but it was a very special moment for him and for our family that he's given such an honor. One of the tragedies of this situation that we find ourselves is that as far as I know, they're not going to let soldiers stand this Yom HaZikaron. But we'll do it virtually, and so we stand in honor of Yoni Netanyahu and all the other soldiers buried here. Nachshon Waxman, son of Esther and Yehuda Waxman, killed in 1994, 19 years old. At the time I was in Bris Kolel, remember it very well. I'm sure many people who were adults at that time remember Nachshon Waxman. His mother Esther was had made Aliyah. She went to I think she went to Stern College, or certainly to Central, and she made Aliyah. Met her husband Yehuda, Israeli, and her son was kidnapped, similar to what we're going to share about Yehoshua Friedberg. He was getting a tramp, hiking back to hitching a ride back to his base, and wasn't heard from. Since then, by the way, Israeli soldiers are not allowed to hitch rides anymore. That law changed after Nachshon Waxman and Yehoshua Friedberg. And he was taken hostage, and then appears on TV a video. The Hamas are asking for an exorbitant ransom of freeing many hundreds of prisoners from Israeli jails, terrorists, in exchange for the life of Nachshon Waxman. And the whole world was praying for him. I remember Erev Shabbat, there was a call to go to the Kotel, and maybe 100,000 Jews of all kinds, religious, not religious, Hasidic, Yeshivish, Kippot Zergot, everyone came, everyone was davening for Nachshon Waxman. And we were sure that somehow a miracle would happen. How could God turn away these tefillah? And then Motzei Shabbat, we got the terrible news that Nachshon was killed in a botched operation. They had sent in the Sayeret Matkal to go and to try to retrieve him. And it was almost successful. And part of the double tragedy was that the head of that Yechidah, of that group of Sayeret Matkal, his name was Nir Paraz. He was 24 years old. His father, Ma'oz Paraz, was a decorated Israeli Air Force pilot who had been tragically killed in the Yom Kippur War. And when Nir wanted to join the army, his mother said, but no Air Force, absolutely no Air Force, I won't sign. He wanted to go to the Air Force like his father, the hero. His mother said, absolutely no, would not agree to the Air Force. Every mother who lost her husband, or any family member loses someone, a mother has to sign off to allow her child to serve in the army, in a combat unit, I should say. And so she would not sign on the Air Force, but he said, okay, I'll try for Sayeret Matkal. And he got through the Gibush and became Sayeret Matkal. He had completed his 5 years in the army, and then he was called back to lead this group as the Katzin, as the officer of this Yechidah, and tragically he was killed in that operation near Paraz. He's buried elsewhere. But the mother, after burying her husband, then later on buried her son. Yehi Zichron Baruch. Emmanuel Moreno, born in France, killed in summer of 2006, considered the greatest soldier perhaps in the world. He is considered the greatest soldier in the Israeli army. He was involved in more missions, mostly secret missions, more than any other soldier in the history of the Israeli army. And many consider the Israeli army to be the greatest in the world, so if he's the greatest soldier in the greatest army, would make him the greatest soldier in modern times. Emmanuel Moreno was a yeshiva student. He had studied also in the Eli Yeshiva, in the Mechina and Eli, like Ro'i Klein, who's buried just 2 rows away from him. And he was the last soldier that was killed in Lebanon in the Second Lebanon War. There's so much to say about Emmanuel Moreno. And if you Google him, you'll find so much about him, but what you won't find is a picture of him. Till today, 14 years later, you will not find a picture of Emmanuel Moreno. The operations that he was involved in, the missions that he was involved in, was so secret that till today they can't publish his picture. Because even today it would compromise soldiers in the field, members of Sayeret Matkal, which he was a member of. Naftali Bennett, the current Secretary of Defense in Israel, was a soldier in the same unit with Emmanuel Moreno. He was killed and left behind a widow and 4 children. Again, there's so much to say about him, but maybe just one story that we have shared in Poland. Some of you who are watching this heard the story about him, that when his wife was sitting shiva for him, one of his fellow soldiers came to visit and sat with her and said, I want to tell you about the last conversation I had with Emmanuel just a few days before he was killed. We were in a helicopter, and he turned to me. I'm not a religious person in practice, but he turned to me and he said, if we were hit by a ground-to-air missile, as the case was several weeks before, a helicopter was shot down, so we're hit now and we have 5 seconds to live, what would you do? He says, I don't know, I would just, maybe just count down, hoping that I would not be in a lot of pain. So I turned to him and said, what would you do? He said, what do you mean? I would fill those 5 seconds with meaning. I would say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. I would fill that with meaning. And then he turned to me and he said words that I felt like I was punching my stomach, the most difficult words I ever heard. He said, if you can't find meaning in the last 5 seconds of your life, the question is whether your whole life had meaning. Emmanuel Moreno taught us, both in his life and in his death, how valuable time is, how we can fill every moment of our life with meaning. It doesn't make a difference if we're in Israel or if we're in lockdown in our homes in the US and the UK or wherever we are. Every moment that we are given is a blessing, is an avoda. We can fill it with meaning. We can fill it by learning, by doing chesed, by being nice to our siblings. There are myriad ways that we can fill our lives with meaning. But that's our task in this world, to fill our lives with meaning, not to wait to the moment when we have to say Shema Yisrael, but every night we say Shema Yisrael. Every night or every morning, 3 times a day in fact, we say Shema Yisrael, Shacharit, Mariv, and Kriyat Shema Lamita, filling our lives with meaning. And Emmanuel Moreno is one of the lessons that we learn, a life of meaning. And again, there are 2 types of Kedoshim. There are those who died al Kiddush Hashem, and it's a way to live on Kiddush Hashem. We don't need more people to die al Kiddush Hashem. We need more people to live al Kiddush Hashem, and that's our task today. Uriel Peretz, the son of Miriam and Eliezer Peretz. He was born actually in Sharm el-Sheikh in Sinai, where his parents had lived before Sinai was given to Egypt. 22 years old, fell in Lebanon in 1998. And Uriel Peretz is one of the sons of Miriam Peretz. Miriam Peretz is perhaps the most beloved woman in the whole country, maybe the most beloved woman in the Jewish world. She's a symbol of strength and a broken heart, because she paid the price of having lost 2 sons, Uriel, and 2 rows away, Eli Raz. Follow me. Eli Raz Peretz, Ben Miriam and Eliezer, fell in Gaza in 2010. 12 years after she buried her son, she buries another son. He was 32 years old, already married with a family. Also studied in the Mechina in Eli. And Miriam comes here and she describes, and again this year she won't be able to come, but she describes the Yom Zikaron. Where do I stand? Do I stand next to Eli Raz, or do I stand next to Uriel? Where do I stand? I only have 1 heart. I only have 2 legs. Where do I stand? And despite having lost 2 sons, Miriam, you can watch her on YouTube, she is the symbol of strength. She is an amazing, amazing woman. And unfortunately, the story of having lost two sons is not unique to the Miriam Peretz. There are over 40 families in Israel that have paid the price at least twice, losing two sons or two brothers. One of them, well-known, Dror Weinberg. Dror Weinberg was the highest-ranking religious soldier in the Israeli army at the time that he was killed in Hebron in a battle between terrorists. And his mother, Batsheva Weinberg, had lost her two brothers in 1967. She lost two brothers, and then she lost her son. Dror Weinberg's son was my son's mifaked in the army. So some of the families in Israel have paid a very, very heavy price numerous times. And again, as we had said, if you lose a son, then the army says we're not going to take any of the other children into as a kravi, as a combat soldier. A mother has to sign off on it. And so after she lost her son, she signed off that Eli Raz can serve in the army. And then after Eli Raz, she had two more sons that served in the army. They also served in combat units. This is the strength of the Jewish mother. This is the strength of the Jewish people. We know our lives are in God's hands at the end of the day. And we hope and pray that this is those that are buried here will be the last ones that we have to bury. That there will be no more soldiers that have to give their life to the Jewish people. Only here, B'sarot Tovot, for Am Yisrael, for Eretz Yisrael, for the Jewish people, wherever they are found. Thank you for joining us. Just before we leave here, I wanted to share with you an unbelievable song. And there are many, many songs that have been written in memory of many of the different soldiers that were killed. In Tzuk Eitan in 2014, one of the soldiers was killed with Sean Munshine, together with 6 of his friends in one of the battles near Aza. And Hanan Ben Ari wrote a song based on the letters that he left, actually the text that he had left for his family, WhatsApp messages that he left for his family, and he turned it into a song. And I'd like to read you a translation of the song as that song is being played. It's called Laila Tov, Sean. Mom, I truly love you. You are the most amazing mother in the world. More than one could possibly ask for. I didn't want to worry you about us entering into Gaza. Please be strong for me. And if something happens to me, smile with pride. I love you. I love you. I love you. Dad, you're truly a wonderful father. Dad, a real man. And even though we argued this last month, don't fret over it. I love you. I love you. So if you are reading these letters, it's likely that I went to sleep. Laila Tov, Sean.
שהוא עושה מצווה אחת, מביא גאולה לעולם. ומי שהוא לומד רק מילה של תורה, כאילו בונה עולם. מי שהוא עושה קידוש השם, השכינה שורה בעולם.